Okay. So, hi everyone. I'm Max. I'm a blockchain engineer from a company called Climatics, and I'm going to talk about ION, which is our open interoperability protocol. And we've got a number of bounties involving ION, so we really want to give everyone a good overview of the protocol so everyone can hit the ground running and start building as soon as possible. Nearly there, nearly there. Right, thank you. So first, maybe a little bit about Climatics. So we're based in London and we're founded in 2015. And we're founded in 2015. And currently we're about 40 plus people with expertise in privacy, consensus, and financial markets. And we consider ourselves a core blockchain infrastructure company. And even though we're often thinking about the financial industry, we think that the work we're doing in privacy and consensus can apply to different industries. And so we have a flagship project called the Utility Settlement Coin, which aims to do interbank payments on a fork of Ethereum. And currently we're working with 17 member banks on this project. So as I've said, we're kind of focused on the financial industry. And we see there's going to be a project like the Utility Settlement Coin providing settlement target, and that might be one blockchain. But there's going to be a lot of different networks in this ecosystem. So for example, there might be trading platforms running on one thing, or there might be other platforms doing anti-money laundering and KYC in areas such as data identity. And we don't want them just to be silos that don't talk to each other. Data needs to flow through the entire ecosystem so that value can be transferred between different networks, and that we can build the use cases that we want. So we call this the distributed financial market infrastructure. And it's from this thought that interoperability is extremely important to Climatics. So we have projects, as I mentioned, that are going to do settlement, but we also see there's going to be different platforms, maybe running different types of protocols that are going to perform different functions. So there might be trading platforms, security platforms, and ultimately the data all needs to flow between these different platforms back to perform different things like settlement. But we're not the first people to think about interoperability. There's people, quite radical people who say, just use Bitcoin. And actually, if you want to just transfer value, it's quite good. But it doesn't allow you to build complex use cases on top of it. There's other people who might say, just have one network of the same kind of platform and, use a tool like Corda Settler to perform interoperability between these platforms, which is not invalid, but having one platform doesn't really lend to resilience in the wider ecosystem. Then there's other things such as bridging cryptocurrencies like Ripple, and they have similar problems to Bitcoin. They just allow value transfer. Again, there's things like use case specific interoperability, so atomic swaps and the like, and they're actually really cool projects and allow two parties to exchange value just between them. But you have to develop your use case with the core protocol in mind. And there's no separation of building different use cases with the same interoperability, which means every time you want a new use case, you have to think about everything again, which doesn't help development of lots of different things. Then there's other people, sort of Cosmos and Polkadot, who take a protocol-first approach. And so they say, OK, we have these different networks, and we bake in how we perform interoperability into our platforms, which is one really good solution. However, it has the same issue that when you try to move outside of the ecosystem, you run into issues. So then Climatics is an R&D company. We took a step back and we really looked at what is it we think interoperability should be. So we see that the future ecosystem shouldn't be homogeneous. And what do I mean by that? That there should be different platforms running different use cases so that we can use the right platform for the right purpose. But also, interoperability shouldn't undermine the characteristics and properties of the platform that it's running on. So for example, Ethereum, it has high security properties, which means it's very good for value transfer. But for example, Solidity doesn't allow you to do very, very complex computation. So other platforms might be good for things such as creating trades or creating contracts. And then lastly, we also want interoperability to allow developers to build the use cases that they want. And this is slightly more subtle, but we want to separate the core protocol of the interoperability from using it to develop to develop a use case. And that's something we haven't quite seen before. So that brings us to ION. And what is ION? So we say it's a generalized interoperability protocol. So it's state-based cross-chain interoperability. And by state-based, we mean we take state from one blockchain and we pass it verifiably to another blockchain or another platform. And then, knowing what's in the state, we can query that and perform more computation dependingly. Additionally, ION's use case and platform agnostic. It's not opinionated on how you bring the state between two blockchains. Rather, it builds a framework of how you should best do that so that you can then build the use cases on top of it. And so that the people who need to know, who want to build the use cases, they only need to know how to get the data. Whereas the people developing the core protocol, they can focus on that. Additionally, it should be trustless. We don't want to have someone sitting between the chain performing extra validation. Rather, the way data passes from one blockchain to another blockchain should be completely open and not opinionated. So for example, if you look in the ION repo, there's a number of tools that allow you to do that. But you're not forced to use them. You can move the data in the way best for your use case. Additionally, we don't want to be relying on tokens or incentive mechanisms. And whilst projects like Plasma have really cool ideas with incentive mechanisms, in our space, which is more enterprise, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to having incentive mechanisms, especially where, for example, in financial markets, the values are really large. And so then some stakings, they'd have to be even larger. So it's not clear they always function. And then lastly, we don't want to have an ICO associated with our interoperability. So, as I said, there's kind of two parts of ION. There's the first part, which is the core interoperability protocol, and then there's kind of another layer on top of that, which is how you develop the use cases. So I, as a use case developer, to me, ION is just an expanding library of interfaces, where the complexity of the interoperability is abstracted away from me, so I don't have to think about that. And the reason we want to do that is because if I have to, each time I create a new use case, think about, okay, what are the specific characteristics of the two blockchains I'm interoperating between, then it takes focus away from building the complex use cases you might want and the business logic that need to stick behind it. So doing this, we can see it's far easier for, in this great picture, to, we could start on the blue blockchain and execute something, move that state to the white blockchain, execute something else, and then lastly move to the red blockchain and do something else. And creating those sort of continuous execution strings of moving value between all these blockchains is a lot harder if you each time have to think of the core protocol that you're interoperating with. So abstracting that allows you to do a lot more complex things. But sitting underneath this is obviously the black box, where the states are verifiably transferred between the two networks. So to do that, there's two different things that happen. So firstly, when we take state from one blockchain and pass it to another, we need to know, okay, well, is this a real piece of data from the blockchain we're interoperating with? And so that is where the understanding of the two systems you're trying to bridge really comes into play. So for different types of consensus mechanism, you need to have a different form of state validation. And for different platforms, it changes even more. But then once we verifiably pass the state from blockchain to blockchain, we need to be able to assert that a state transition actually happened. And so, for example, in Ethereum, this might require you to look in the transaction and transaction receipt state routes and create a proof. Whereas in other blockchain platforms like Fabric, there's different ways to do it. So they have an event model as well, but also they have a ledger where you could directly query, okay, what is the value in this ledger at this point in time? And so each time you create the new implementation or a specific implementation of the ION protocol, you really need to understand the core characteristics of the blockchains you're interoperating with. And so, okay, that was a lot of information. There's the use case, there's the core protocol, but how does that really move together? So the one thing ION gives you is a generic architecture for implementing your interoperability. And so as part of this architecture, we have three different things. We have the validation module, so that's where the state verification occurs. Then the block storage module, where the blocks are stored after they're verified. And then lastly, the function execution contracts, which query the block storage and perform the state transition verification. And so we can see in this diagram, we have three different platforms, which could be three different types of blockchains, three different systems entirely. And we could start on platform B, where we execute a function, which is appended to the state. That state is then transferred to the validation contract on platform A, but specifically the validation contract which relates to the consensus mechanism of platform B. Then, once this is verified, we pass the block to the block storage contract, where it then waits for someone to query what the state in this block. So people who are building use cases, they only need to think of, okay, the block storage is here, and this is the interface through which I interact with the block storage, and so how can I get a piece of data, and how can I verify that X happened so I can do Y? So as I've spoken, the ION protocol has lots of different implementations, but is just a general way of building those implementations in a way that the people developing use cases can really best interact with data and get the things they want. And so we have what's a kind of a whole protocol suite, or a suite of softwares, better said, sorry, that are developed for the ION protocol. And we call this shamelessly the ionosphere. So within this, for example, people who are looking to build on ION, maybe in the hackathon, there's lots of different projects. So for example, we have something called Transact ION, which does a Ethereum to Ethereum interoperability, looking to do what's known as a payment versus payment. So basically, Alice pays Bob on one blockchain, and then Bob pays Alice on another blockchain. Alternative, we have another project called Simple Shares, which does something even slightly different to the PvP. It does a delivery versus payment, where shares are issued and traded on a Hyperledger Fabric network, and then that state is passed to an Ethereum network where the trades are settled. And so, looking at that, we can see that ION allows you to potentially use the best network or best platform for what you want to do, because Hyperledger Fabric allows consortia of maybe which require slightly less security properties to do quite complicated workflowing, but then transfer to Ethereum when you want to do the thing that Ethereum's really good at, which is settle value. And also, we have a number of other projects. So last week, we had a hackathon in London called Hack ION, where a number of teams used ION to build their own use cases, such as hopefully people will do over this weekend. So for example, a company called Ardara did a two-currency FX swap between our Autonity testnet, which is open for people to work on, and Rinkeby. Then another, Santander, used Fabric and Ethereum to do something similar to the Simple Shares, but with, I think, a letter of credit. And lastly, a company called Web3 used Quorum, which has the idea of secret enclaves, where to fix LIBOR, so they said, where in the secret enclaves, each member or pseudo-bank posted their LIBOR rate, and then a regulator was able to take from each of these secret enclaves and publish that on a public Ethereum network. And that just shows how how different platforms have different properties, and how ION allows you to really use the right tool for your use case. So that's all well and good, but how can the people here build on ION? So we have a number of ION bounties. So there's a 2,000 bounty for build on the ION protocol. So what we want people to do is people who have expertise in different blockchain platforms, people who are very good at gas golf, can improve the efficiency of our core ION protocol. And then we also have build with ION. So this is the use case perspective, and people could build something such as a DEX, more atomic swaps, or maybe they could link our testnet as a sidechain to the mainnet. There are lots of different things you could do. And lastly, we have a number of bounties for people who just use ION in a way maybe we didn't expect, just somehow use ION or build a cool tool. We'd really like something like that. So I hope that was a quite brief and overview of the ION protocol. And obviously, that's not so easy to consume immediately, so we have a lot of other information. So I recommend anyone who wants to use ION should definitely check out our GitHub, where we have a wiki which has a lot of details on the generic ION protocol, but also details of specific implementations for Ethereum, for Clique, for Istanbul Consensus, and lots of other things. Also, maybe if you want to follow our journey of how we came up with ION, there's our Medium, where we have a number of posts which talk about our thinking and also our motivation for ION. And lastly, if people need help using ION, they should reach out to us through our Gitter, which is Gitter Climatics ION, and we'll reply immediately. Or you should check us out on the floor above here, where we have a stand. and which manned all hours. Right, so I'm Max. I hope anyone who has any questions can come to me or my other colleagues wearing t-shirts. And if anyone has any questions right now, then fire away.
Hello. Hey. So as I understand, is it only between permission chain? The interoperability is only between permission chains, or is it between private and the public chains?
So ION isn't opinionated on whether you do that. Currently, because we're focused on permission chains, we haven't, I wouldn't say Rinkeby is a permission chain. So that is an open network, but if it can do either. Public chains, permission chains, different platforms, but you would have to implement, so example, for proof of work, right? There's no way of knowing in the same way in Rinkeby, did a validator create this block or did a miner create this block? So you'd have to build a slightly different validation module, but that would be up to the person who's implementing the contract and what they wanted from it.
Oh, that makes sense. All right,
cool.
Thanks. Anybody else?
Thank you very much.